Is limbo still a thing in Catholicism? Stick around to find out. Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host Michael on a Thursday. There's two views that I constantly hear people talk about whenever they bring up the subject of limbo. One view will say, well, this is dogmatized in the Catholic Church and there's no denying it. And thus, any baby who dies without baptism, it's dogma that they go to limbo. There's that one group. And then there's another group that is kind of on the other extreme, and they want to say, look, limbo is just a theological opinion, and Pope Benedict XVI has done away with it. Both of those are actually in error. Both of them are mistaken. The first group is confused about some things that the Council of Florence says. And then the second group is confused by some things that the International Theological Commission has said about the question of limbo. And so I want to take a look at both of those, and so that we can navigate between both of these errors, because neither of those positions are correct. In order to do so, I want to review an article written by Father Thomas Reese, a Catholic Jesuit priest, who wrote an article called "The Catholic Church Can Never Admit That Something It Taught for Centuries Was Dumb." That's the name of the article. I'm going to review it, and in the process, I'm going to navigate between both of those positions that are in error. And I am going to look at the Council of Florence. We're going to look at the International Theological Commission, as well as a few other documents to, again, balance things out. As far as Father Reese's very short article, with all due respect to him as a Catholic priest, it was the most pitiful treatment I have ever seen on limbo. And that's saying a lot, because there's been some incredibly unedifying things written on the doctrine of limbo from both sides of the debate. And oddly enough, I'm more sympathetic to Father Reese's position, although I don't agree with his position, but I'm a little more sympathetic to it. And yet I found it to be incredibly atrocious, as we're going to see here in a moment. It's also very not very helpful to start out the article with an article title saying that this was dumb. I mean, I'm just saying that's probably not going to win over a lot of people to your position, Father. So just FYI for any future articles you may intend to write. But it was the poorest treatment I've ever seen with limbo, and he completely misunderstands some things about the International Theological Commission. Before we look at it, let me just briefly define our terms here. What exactly is limbo? So limbo just means fringe or border, and it's specifically in reference to the border of hell. So limbo is actually part of hell, but not the part of hell where the damned people, like, a Hitler would go. Not that part of hell, where people who have actually committed horrible sins go, and if they die in that state. That's not the part of hell we're talking about. What we're talking about is the afterlife, a place that is not heaven, but it's also not the place where the damned and the evil people go. It's this intermediate state, because for people who would go to limbo, it would be a place that has to be distinguished between what the saints enjoy in heaven and what somebody like a Hitler would be going through. Because obviously, if there's an infant in limbo, the infant hasn't committed any personal acts. So it makes no sense that they would be in that part of hell. So hell just refers to the afterlife. It is where all go who are not enjoying God in the beatific vision in heaven. And there are different compartments, if you will, if we're going to use physical terms here. There's different sections, if you will, to hell. There would be a limbo part where innocent infants would be. And then there would also be another compartment for people who were saints in the Old Testament prior to the ascension of Jesus, where they would have gone. It's called Limbo of the Fathers. And then there's the hell of the damned, where people who have committed evil acts and die outside of God's friendship would go. There's also Tartarus, which is another part of hell where the fallen angels, i.e. demons, are. So just to briefly define our terms to make sure we understand what's going on here, that's what limbo is. And so now the question is, okay, does the Catholic Church teach that unbaptized infants go to limbo, or has that been done away with, or is it dogma? Is it just a theological opinion? That's what we're going to consider as we look through this article. I am going to share my screen so we can see Father Reese's article here. Somebody sent this to me and asked for me to comment on it. I was just surprised by how poor of a take this was. The Catholic Church can never admit that something it taught for centuries was dumb, again, is the title. Pope Benedict closed limbo and no one complained. What if Pope Francis had done so, is the subtitle. That's already a problem because Pope Benedict didn't do that. But we're going to look at the International Theological Commission, and I'll straighten the record here. Many conservative Catholics are upset with Pope Francis, who they complain is changing church doctrine, which he's not. But he is right that there are plenty of people who complain about that. But they hardly blinked when Pope Benedict got rid of limbo, a Catholic doctrine that had been taught for centuries. That is factually false. Benedict XVI did not get rid of limbo. Careful readers will note that rather than closing limbo, as reported by the media, what the International Theological Commission did under Benedict in 2007 was downgrade limbo from church doctrine to a hypothesis or theory, also inaccurate. It no longer must be presented as church teaching. In other words, if you don't have to believe in limbo, you don't have to believe in limbo, but you can if you want. This is factually inaccurate, but I could completely understand how somebody who has not studied the question extensively would come away with this impression. So I understand why Father Reese takes this position. I get exactly where he took a left turn and misunderstood some things. I also get where the other extreme takes a left turn and misunderstands some things with the Council of Florence. Make no mistake about it, though, Benedict killed limbo. No, he didn't. Just as much as the Second Vatican Council killed the Latin Mass. No, it did not. No, it did not. I think that this is a horrible, horrible analogy. The Second Vatican Council did not kill the Latin Mass. This is just an incredibly shallow perception of Sacrosanctum Concilium. I don't know how anybody could actually study the document of the Second Vatican Council and come away with that impression. It's okay, but that's a completely different show, so I'm just going to move on. Hypothesis or not, no one is going to teach it. Limbo will become a theological anachronism that historians of theology know, but everyone else ignores. Factually mistaken here. It is not mentioned, for example, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Also, not entirely true. Paragraph 4 of 5 implies it. It does not use the word limbo, but it necessarily implies it. So it's factually true that the Catechism of the Catholic Church doesn't say the word limbo, but the concept is certainly there. Again, paragraph 4 of 5. Moreover, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is not somehow an exhaustive summary of Catholic doctrine. Well, I'll stick with what I said. It's not an exhaustive summary of Catholic doctrine. It might be a very helpful summary of Catholic doctrine. It might be, that a great deal of Catholic doctrines are summarized there, but it doesn't literally summarize every single Catholic doctrine. So even if, let's say the Catholic Church teaches limbo, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church says nothing about it, that wouldn't take away from the fact that it's still an authoritative teaching. It would just say that the Catechism skipped over one of these doctrines, and that's not saying much because, again, the Catechism doesn't mention every specific single doctrine that the Catholic Church teaches. It's there to kind of give you a summary. And again, it's implied in paragraph 4 or 5. So I think Father has some misunderstandings here. Limbo was a theological solution to the problem of what happens to good and but unbaptized people after they die. Yeah. I could go with that. The New Testament is full of passages that say baptism is necessary for salvation. Yep. Catholic teaching said baptism was necessary to wash away original sin, which we inherited from Adam and Eve. But sending unbaptized infants to hell seemed especially cruel. Well, let me stop there. First of all, we're dealing with two things in Scripture. We're dealing, number one, with the New Testament talking about the necessity of baptism for salvation. But we're also dealing with the fact that the New Testament teaches God desires everyone to be saved. So you have to look for a way to resolve both of those things. But he says, but sending unbaptized infants to hell seemed especially cruel. So yeah, if you have a caricature understanding of what limbo is, sure, that would seem cruel. But God doesn't owe anyone heaven. So for God to not give somebody heaven, that's not cruel. Heaven is not owed to anybody. It's not a debt to pay. God is not being unjust if he does not give heaven to somebody. Heaven is received as a gift by grace. It would not be cruel for God to not give someone heaven. It would, however, be cruel if God punishes an innocent infant in the same way that he punishes a Hitler. That would be cruel and that would be unjust. But that's not what God does, and that's not what limbo is. All right, he continues, how could God, who is described as merciful and loving in the parable of the prodigal son, do such a thing? Okay, because it's not an issue of mercy or love. It's not an issue of either. It's not when we speak of mercy here, we're talking about withholding something that is somehow like a just punishment. But they're not being tortured in limbo or something like that. And God's just saying, okay, well, let me be merciful. You deserve this torture, but I'm going to be merciful. To put it in those terms is to misunderstand the category of the discussion. Rather, we should redefine it and reword the question and say, does God owe innocent infants heaven? The answer to that theologically should be no, unless you're a Pelagian heretic. Now, I'm going to assume Father is not a Pelagian heretic. So I'm going to assume he agrees, heaven is by grace. Okay. Well, if you believe it's by grace, then don't talk to me about mercy. Don't talk to me about that because that's the wrong category. Love. Again, what kind of love? Supernatural love? Does God owe that to somebody? No. So again, it's the wrong category. But the way he sets it up, it sounds like, who's going to say, oh, well, I believe God's an unmerciful and unloving God. Like, nobody's going to say that. But by setting it up in these terms, he's going to have people say, well, I agree. Yeah, God should be merciful and loving to these infants. But limbo is not an unmerciful and unloving thing. So again, category error here in rhetoric. It gets worse. We need to remember that for the ancients, hell or Hades was the underworld, the place of the dead. Thus, in the creed, when we say Jesus descended into hell, we're not speaking of a place of eternal damnation, but the domain of the dead. It's more complex than that. Hades encompasses the place of the damned, the place of the Old Testament righteous, and also the place of demons. Like there's multiple ways and there's different compartments, if you will, to such a thing. And to just kind of pigeonhole everything into one of those categories is a theological error. It's all of those things. He says, no church father before Augustine thought unbaptized infants would be punished. Well, to my recollection, I don't recall any of them saying that an unbaptized infant would experience, some kind of torment or something like that. I don't recall anybody before Augustine's time. So for the moment, I'll concede that. He says, St. Augustine, however, believed unbaptized children would experience the misery of the damned, but consigned to the mildest part of hell. And that's accurate. That was Augustine's position. And he was wrong about that. The church did not go with his position there. although that is still a theological opinion. But it's certainly a theological opinion that is an extreme minority. So the majority of theologians would say that's inaccurate. Augustine was such a theological giant that there was reluctance to question his teaching, especially when all theologians at the time were men without children. I don't think that that's a rational explanation. I think that's a straw man. It wasn't that they were reluctant to question his teachings. Absurd. That wasn't the reason why. It was, however, reiterated by other church fathers after Augustine. That could certainly contribute to it. Around 1300, the term limbo, from the Latin limbus, meaning edge or boundary of hell, became used for the dwelling place of the good or innocent dead who were not baptized. This is distinguished from purgatory, where sinners are purified before they go to heaven, and hell, where the biggest sinners spend eternity. Poor explanation, Father. Border of what is the question you should be asking yourself. Border of hell, that's what it is. So it seems like he understands hell here in a way that just muddies the waters. And I want to say, wait, you need to pay attention to the fact that hell has multiple compartments, if you will. So there's a failure to appreciate the complexity of this location. Medieval theologians debated how much innocent babies suffered in limbo, and as time went on, the consensus view was that they did not suffer at all. Correct. Aside from the suffering of the loss of the beatific vision. Sure. They experienced natural happiness, but not supernatural happiness. Right. So you can see like Aquinas saying that an infant in limbo experiences this perfect natural happiness and even has natural communion with God. Which, if anybody goes to limbo, that's not a bad thing, right? How is that unmerciful? How is that unloving of God? Perfect natural happiness? Perfect natural communion with God? That's not a bad deal. That's a pretty great thing. So it's like he recognizes that. He recognizes that it's a place of supernatural happiness. I'm sorry, natural happiness. But then he wants to set it up as this is unmerciful and unloving. It's just rhetoric. He says also debated was whether they would remain in limbo forever or just until the end of time. Yeah, that seems to be like more of a recent debate. I'm not aware of that taking place at any significant level historically. I know Maritain held to that view, along with his belief that Satan and the fallen angels would also be redeemed. But it tends to be an incredibly minority view. Theologians twisted themselves into pretzels trying to reconcile what Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and church councils and others said about limbo and unbaptized infants. I think that's more of a straw man. I think what they're doing is they are twisting themselves into a pretzel, as he put it, because Scripture, the Bible, presents this tension. I'm not saying there's no way to resolve the tension. I do believe that there is. But pretend Augustine never existed, Aquinas never existed, these councils never existed, you would still have the same problem because it goes back to Scripture. It's a tension found in Scripture. The necessity of baptism for salvation, and then God's universal will. That's where it comes from. Once again, he kind of presents it as a straw man, and I don't find that very helpful. Limbo eventually came to be seen as a temporary holding area or waiting room for the edge of hell, where the unbaptized would be kept until the end of time, when they would be admitted into heaven. Again, that's a very minority view. Residing there was not only unbaptized children, but also the patriarchs and other good people from the Old Testament. Not exactly. Because in Catholic theology, those patriarchs and good people are no longer there. They're experiencing God in the beatific vision. So they're no longer in a state of limbo. Jesus went and preached the good news according to the New Testament to those souls in hell. And then he brought them on high. he brought them with him in his ascension. So he preached the good news to the patriarchs and other Old Testament righteous and brought them with him at the ascension. So they now experience the beatific vision. They're no longer in limbus patrum, or a limbo of the fathers. That was the case prior to Jesus' ascension. Moreover, again, we have to distinguish between limbo of the fathers and limbo of infants. Limbo of the fathers is empty, if you will. Limbo of infants is a different question, which we're going to consider whenever we actually look at Florence, and then we're going to look at the International Theological Commission. I'm going to set the record straight. But first, I want to get through his article before I start to go into the actual sources. It was also open to the millions of good people who have never heard of Jesus. When I grew up in the 1950s, this was all clearly taught in the Baltimore Catechism, along with all the other dogmas we had to accept to be Catholic. No good Catholic could question such teaching. Not so sure about that one. Benedict threw it out the window. He threw open the gates of heaven. No rhetoric there, huh, Father? He threw open the gates of heaven. It's like, oh yeah, the stuff with Limbo, you guys are just trying to close heaven on everyone, and you're just mean and stuffy. And Benedict came here and just opened the gates of heaven. Come on. Is anyone buying this rhetoric? He threw open the gates of heaven for the unbaptized, reversing centuries of church teaching. False. That is false. That's my bread and butter. This is my doctoral thesis, doctrinal reversals. I love how, and I'm not seriously loving it, I love how people take church and doctrinal reversals for granted when they shouldn't. They're quick to just throw the church under the bus and say, it's been reversed. No, not exactly. As we'll see here in a little bit. Strictly speaking, the International Theological Commission, which is an advisory body, has absolutely zero magisterial authority, but that's still going to be irrelevant, and we'll see why in a little bit. But it has absolutely zero magisterial teaching authority. Strictly speaking, the International Theological Commission was only willing to affirm that there are strong grounds for hope that God will save infants when we have not been able to do for them what we would have wished to do, namely to baptize them into the faith and life of the church. Now, he's right that the ITC says that we can have hope. That part is accurate. Anyone who pays attention to what Jesus says about his Father's will his Father will not only will have not only strong hope, but also absolute certainty that unbaptized children go to heaven. This is where Father goes way too far. The magisterium does talk about hope, but it itself notes you cannot have that certainty. And what Father is doing is he's being presumptuous here and presuming upon God's grace, which is not allowed. We cannot presume upon God's grace. We can hope for God's grace, but you cannot assume with certitude. There's no grounds for such certitude. There's nothing in Jesus that would afford such certitude. I wish there was. I wish there was. But there's nothing in Jesus that would indicate that. There are things in Jesus that would indicate that we can have hope, but he goes a step too far. He goes a step beyond that, saying certitude, and that's where Father has become presumptuous and is presuming upon God's grace, which is something we need to avoid doing according to the New Testament. So he is theologically in error there. Of course, the church would never admit something it was teaching or doing for centuries was dumb. It was dumb, he says. Well, Father, you seem to have a very low opinion of the church that you serve. Are you sure you should be writing publicly for the church as one of its representatives when you feel this way about the church? Okay. He says, of course, the church would never admit something it was teaching or doing for centuries was dumb. Be careful. Be careful, Father, because what you're doing is, as I'm going to show you here in a moment, even though I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, You're now calling something that God has said dumb. Be careful. That was a very rash thing to do. Very foolish, because you ended up, again, saying that something that God does teach is dumb. I hope you walk that back. He says, rather, it has to find some way to pretend it was all a misunderstanding. Again, Father seems to have a very low opinion of the church he serves. Allowing limbo to be a hypothesis is the theological equivalent of reforming the liturgy, but allowing people to continue attending the traditional Latin Mass in the belief that it will eventually die out. Not exactly analogous, but you can see where Father is coming from and where his sympathies are. So, and again, I'm kind of sympathetic and, to what Father is saying and correcting the radical traditionalists and stuff like that, but he goes a step too far with this stuff, and he needs to come back in. Got to balance this stuff out. There's some legitimate criticisms of the radical traditionalists, but you can then become radically progressive and go to the opposite extreme, and that needs to be corrected. And what I want to do is say the radical traditionalists are wrong on the Mass and on the issue of limbo, and the radical progressives are also wrong on the Mass and wrong on limbo. All of y'all are wrong. Both of y'all are wrong. Father Reese, you're wrong. Radical traditionalists, you're wrong too. I'm going to show you where Florence and the ITC can be harmonized. And the church is actually offering a harmonized view, and both of these guys are in error. That is Father Reese's camp and then the radical traditionalist camp. The Theological Commission argues that limbo never entered into the dogmatic tradition of the magisterium, even if that same magisterium did at time mention the theory in its ordinary teaching up until Second Vatican Council. That's not entirely accurate, unless what they mean, the ITC means, is that it's not a dogma that anybody actually does go there. But sneak peek, the possibility of limbo is a definitive teaching. Again, the ITC is not magisterial. It's not authoritative, but it also shouldn't be immediately dismissed and ignored, because it kind of shows you what direction the church is leaning to. But it doesn't overturn anything. So, like, even if there was a contradiction between like previous teachings, let's say Florence and the ITC, let's say there was a contradiction, the ITC cannot reverse. It cannot reverse Florence, because it's not a magisterial document, and it was never promulgated in any magisterial fashion. Therefore, it would just be an opinion that cannot reverse actual authoritative teachings. But he presents it as if it's magisterial, and that's the problem. It actually carries zero magisterial authority. That being said, what the ITC is saying is actually mostly true. And I believe it can actually be harmonized with Florence. So there's no real tension here. There's no real contradiction. But even if there were, the ITC can't reverse Florence because it's not magisterial. But it depends on what we mean by limbo wasn't dogmatic. Do you mean the theoretical possibility, or do you mean that anyone actually ever goes there? The possibility under certain conditions, that is dogmatic. That anybody actually does go there under those conditions is not dogmatic. It's a theological opinion. That's where both sides are missing things. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit when we go to the actual documents. But that's where both of them are mistaken. And I can completely understand why they're mistaken, why they hold those views, because I have to admit, it does require some serious studying. I had to do a lot of studying on the question of limbo to be able to see how these things are actually harmonized. But I could see at first, if somebody hasn't really done that research, I could see how they would gravitate to one or the other. He says that is a sophisticated way of saying the church can never be wrong. That's nonsense. Father, stop it. Just stop. Stop it with this ridiculous rhetoric. This is not doing the church a service. Maybe this is supposed to be, cheeky, and this is supposed to somehow make the Catholic Church look more relatable, but it's not. Please just stop it. The church admits that non-definitive teachings can be reversed. Non-definitive teachings could contain error. That's possible. The church admits that. Please stop it. But there is no question that most Catholics in previous centuries thought limbo was a dogma of the church. Well, I don't care what somebody thought. I don't care what they thought. I just care, what does the church teach? Thousands of parents were told their unbaptized infants were in limbo, which, if true, should have been a comforting thing to them, being that limbo is a place of perfect natural happiness and natural communion with God. That's a comforting thing. That's not a bad thing. What Pope Benedict did was the greatest change in church teaching since the Second Vatican Council. Absolutely false. Father, I really don't believe Father understands the basics of the magisterium. Church teaching wasn't reversed. First of all, there's no contradiction here for there to be a reversal. And second of all, even if there were, it hasn't been reversed because nothing was promulgated magisterially, not in reference to the ITC. Now, I'm going to help Father out and actually point him to something that is taught by the magisterium to try to steel man what he's saying. But he's pointing me to the ITC, which is not authoritative. It's insightful. It's helpful. In terms of its pastoral impact on ordinary Catholics, it ranks up there with the major changes that came out of Vatican II. Not at all. Not at all. And I sincerely question whether or not, in light of this entire discussion, whether Father really understands Vatican II. While mourning their dead infants, parents can now rest assured that their unbaptized children have gone to heaven. Absolutely not. That is too presumptuous. They can hope, they cannot rest assured. You're giving people false hope. Stop it. The church doesn't do that. The church says you can give hope, but you can't give them this kind of certitude. You're giving them a false certitude, I should rather say. We should be giving them hope, but not a certitude. If it had been Pope Francis who questioned limbo, he would have been condemned for conservatives for challenging church dogma. Well, I have no doubt that your radical traditionalists tend to be more lenient towards Benedict and much more unfair towards Pope Francis. So there's some truth there. Benedict could get away with it. Well, he didn't because he didn't do it, but whatever. He could get away with it because accusing him of unorthodoxy would have gone against stereotypes akin to President Nixon going to China. Well, Father, I hate to break it to you, but a lot of radical traditionalists actually accuse Benedict of heresy. Just FYI. In the history books, Benedict will be remembered as the Pope who resigned and the Pope who got rid of limbo. No, only in your mind will he be remembered in that way, Father. Respectfully, I'm trying to be as nice as possible given the inflammatory and absurd nature of this article. And even, might I even suggest slanderous, because he's slandering the church in some ways with the article by suggesting that it just can't admit that it was dumb to say that. Stop it. Although I do think that Benedict will be remembered as the Pope who did his best to harmonize the Second Vatican Council with the preconciliar church through the hermeneutic of continuity. I think he will be remembered for that. And you know what? It sounds like Father Reese could benefit from that. It sounds like Father Reese is toying more with a hermeneutic of rupture than continuity here. Okay. So I'm going to come back here in just a second after a quick break. I'm going to heat up my coffee, and then we are going to actually look at the primary sources, and I'm going to show Father and everybody else watching where he is wrong, and I'm also going to show where the radical traditionalists are wrong. Both of them are wrong. Pox on both of your houses. Be right back. Hey, everybody, just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. reasonandtheology.com. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information. Okay, let's continue here. Let me share my screen. Let's take a look at Florence. Let's start there. This is not all that the church has to say about the question, but it's certainly the most authoritative. So let's start here. First of all, this is an ecumenical council, the Council of Florence, 1400s, and you'll note in the context of this document from the council, it starts with we define, and then the next paragraph also, and the next paragraph also. So one can strongly argue that the we define language includes this paragraph, which is relevant to the question of limbo. If somebody's going to argue otherwise, they could perhaps argue that the language we define is not definitive in nature. Good luck with that one in the context. Maybe it's possible, but I think the burden of proof is going to be on that person. That's going to usually be taken as definitive language. So what comes after this in the immediate context is definitive in nature. That is infallible. But if you're going to argue that this is non-definitive, okay, well, it's non-definitive yet authoritative, and it has never been reversed. Therefore, it requires religious submission of intellect and will. There's nothing in the documents of the magisterium after this that has reversed it, as I'll show. So either way, you have to believe what it's about to say, but I would argue it's a definitive teaching. Okay. It says the souls of those who depart in this life in actual mortal sin, or in original sin alone, go straight away to hell to be punished, but with unequal pains. Okay. So it's talking about two groups of people here. You got one group that says, of this group, people who commit actual grave and mortal sins, they're going to go to hell. And people who die in a state of original sin alone with no actual sins also go to hell, but unequal pains, not the same place, if you will, not the same punishment, if you will. That's important. Somebody who has engaged in actual mortal sin should not be punished in the same way as somebody who merely has original sin but has no actual sins. That's just common sense, right? Your Hitler should not at all be punished in the same way as somebody who doesn't have the beatific vision. They don't have supernatural grace. They have original sin, but they've never committed any actual sins. They're not in the same category. One has voluntarily sinned, one has not. Now, when it speaks of original sin, originally in the Garden of Eden, we had original justice and holiness, as paragraph 4 or 5 of the Catechism notes. We had original justice and holiness. We were morally upright and in a good relationship with God by grace. Adam lost that through his sin and therefore passed on to all his descendants. Not personal culpability for his sin, no, because they didn't commit that, but rather a state or condition of being deprived of original holiness and justice. That is, not in communion with God. That's why Scripture calls people who are born children of wrath. And then you receive baptism to become adopted as a child of God, per the New Testament. So original sin is not an actual sin. It's a condition that one is born in. It's a condition of my will is geared or inclined towards sin. And I am not in a morally upright state. I've lost that original righteousness and holiness that we had in Adam. So you're born into a state separated from God. How can that be rectified? The church says through baptism. Baptism gives that grace to the person to elevate them and bring them to heaven when they die. Because again, heaven is not owed to anybody. It has to be given by grace. Well, somebody who dies in a state of original sin has not been given the grace of heaven. Because if they have been given the grace of heaven, they no longer have original sin by definition. So what it's saying is, in the case of someone who dies in a state of original sin, they go to hell, but not the same part of hell where people who have actual sins go. By definition, that is limbo. That is the concept of limbo. The church is teaching for anyone who dies in a state of original sin, by definition, they go to limbo. It doesn't use the term limbo, but it doesn't have to. It says hell. Hell is part of, or limbo is part of hell. And it's obviously distinct. It's a part of hell that's different from the hell where people who have actual mortal sins go. Therefore, it's not the hell of the damned. Okay, if it's not heaven and it's not the hell of the damned, what hell is it? That is called limbo. What that means is, again, Florence definitively teaches, infallibly teaches, if you die in a state of original sin, you go to limbo. That is not a theological opinion. That is definitive teaching. Here's where the theological opinion comes in. The question is, but do the infants die in the state of original sin? That's the question. We all have to recognize, if the unbaptized infant dies in a state of original sin, then they go to limbo. That's Florence. The question is, but do they die in that state? Or does God remit that original sin in an extraordinary, extra sacramental, that is outside of the sacrament of baptism kind of way? Well, the answer is, we can have a hope that he does. According to the church, we can hope that he does, but you can't have certitude that he does. So you have to balance between these two errors. The radical traditionalist reads this and says limbo is a dogma. And what they mean by that is to say that no infant ever goes to heaven. No unbaptized infant ever goes to heaven. That's what they mean. And they want to say that is dogmatized. That's incorrect. That proposition is not dogmatized. If what you mean by limbo is a dogma, if what you mean by that is all unbaptized infants dogmatically go to limbo, you are in error. Florence is not saying that. Florence is saying if they die in a state of original sin, then they go to limbo. That is dogma. Now the question is, but do they die in that state? That's a different question, and Florence never addresses that question. That's a separate question that Florence is not engaging. So you can't use Florence to say dogmatically unbaptized infants go to limbo and we can never have hope that they go to heaven. That's not true. Because it's possible to say it's dogmatically the case that if an infant dies in a state of original sin, they go to limbo. It's possible to maintain that while still arguing, but I believe and I have hope that God remits that original sin extra sacramentally before they die, and thus they do not die in a state of original sin, and thus they do not go to hell. That is limbo. It's possible to hold both of those views. Now, that latter proposition you can't hold to with any certitude. There's nowhere that promises that such infants would be given the grace of heaven. God nowhere promises that. And that's why Father Reese is presumptuous and rash to say they can have certitude. No, God has never said that. The church has never said that. Where are you getting that from? Now, that's the problem with the rad trads. Now I'm going to show you the problem with Father Reese's position in his misuse of the ITC. Somebody's saying, do I have permission to ask a question? Not in relation to this topic. Well, let's hold off on that, Liam. But if you have any questions on anything related to this, I'll answer those towards the end of the stream. So hold off on those. All right, let me show you where Father Reese is wrong in banking on the ITC. First of all, again, to reiterate, International Theological Commission is not a magisterial organ. It was never magisterially promulgated. Pope Benedict XVI never promulgated this in his magisterium. So you can look at this as a permissible theological opinion, but that's all it is. It's not authoritative. It's not binding on your conscience. It does not require religious submission of intellect and will, since it has not been magisterial promulgated. But it does show at least it's theologically safe as a tolerated opinion, since Pope Benedict puts this on the Vatican website. It's a safe theological opinion, but it's not binding on your conscience. But even so, there's nothing in it that reverses what we just saw from Florence. This, what I'm about to show you, can be harmonized with what we just read from Florence. Therefore, you don't have a case of Benedict reversing anything and canceling out Limbo. No, there's just a misunderstanding of what both of these documents are saying. All right, let's go to the part where it talks about theological opinions. First of all, one theological opinion it says is this: as for the theory that the privation of the beatific vision is their sole punishment, that is unbaptized infants, to the exclusion of any other pain, that is a theological opinion. So it's a theological opinion to say that if a unbaptized infant dies in a state of original sin and goes to limbo, it's a theological opinion to say that they could experience an additional pain. In addition to a loss of the beatific vision, they could also experience pain of the senses. A mild one per Augustine, but a pain of the senses. That is such a low theological opinion, since most theologians have kind of discarded that view. It might be a tolerated opinion, but it's outrageously unlikely as far as a theological opinion. Therefore, it would be more appropriate to say that a person, if there is a person who's in limbo, the only pain they experience is a loss of the beatific vision, no other pains. And even then, I don't like using the term pain, even though I understand the way it's being used technically, historically. When most people think of that, they're not going to understand it that way. So I don't like using the term pain there. Plus, you don't suffer from what you never knew. If you never knew God in heaven, you don't suffer by not knowing him in heaven. You only suffer if you once knew him that way and then lost it. And that's not the case here. So there's no suffering there in that sense of suffering. There's a loss, but it's a loss that you don't know any better of. Okay, despite its long acceptance in the West, the particular theological thesis concerning a natural happiness sometimes ascribed to these infants likewise constitutes a theological opinion. So for somebody who says, okay, for somebody who's in limbo, they experience this perfect natural happiness, that too is a theological opinion, but it is a very common theological opinion. It's a very likely theological opinion that if anybody's in limbo, they're experiencing a place of natural happiness. And that just logically makes sense, right? It logically makes sense. How would you experience otherwise? You don't have sin involved, and you also don't know any better because you never knew God in the beatific vision. Therefore, what state is that other than natural happiness? The only logical conclusion is that it is a state of natural happiness. So I just think rationally, it's the only logical conclusion. Like, what else would they be experiencing? They're not experiencing pain and torture. Therefore, besides the theory of limbo, which remains a possible theological opinion, it says, there can be other ways to integrate and safeguard the principles of faith grounded in Scripture. All right. This is the part that they're confusing. And this is the part that's unclear from the ITC. When they say that limbo is a theological opinion, what do you mean by that? That could be true. That could also be false, depending on what you mean by that. If what the ITC is saying is that the theory of limbo, that is that any infant ever actually goes to limbo, that is a theological opinion. But if it's saying the theory of limbo as a possibility, a theoretical possibility for anyone who dies in a state of original sin, that's not a theological opinion. That's authoritative through Florence. That is magisterial. That is not a theological opinion. That is binding on one's conscience, either as a non-definitive teaching or a definitive teaching, and I argue it's a definitive teaching in the context. But either way, even if it's non-definitive, yet that still requires religious submission of intellect and will. That's more than a theological opinion. Theological opinions are not things that are taught by the magisterium. They're of a lower grade. So I don't automatically read this with a hermeneutic of discontinuity and read the ITC in the worst possible way as presenting rupture. I don't read it that way. I read it in harmony with the past and in harmony with Florence, albeit it is poorly worded. They could have done better there. They could have made that more explicit. I believe what it's saying is, as a theory, in other words, that anyone actually goes there, that anyone actually dies in that state of original sin alone. That's the theological opinion. That's the theory. And I agree, that is just a theological opinion. That's just a theory, because we don't know. We don't know. Does God remit somebody's original sin prior to their death in an extra sacramental way? I don't know. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. It's a theological opinion. So does this overturn Florence? No, on two grounds. Number one, it's not authoritative. So even if there was a contradiction, it can't reverse authoritative teachings. A non-authoritative teaching doesn't cancel out an authoritative teaching, even if there was a contradiction. Number two, there's no necessary theological contradiction here, because I just showed you a way to read it in harmony with Florence. Florence is talking about if somebody dies in a state of original sin, they are deprived of the beatific vision. They go to this fringe place of hell. This is saying that we don't know that anybody actually dies in that state. There you go. I just harmonized them for you. Now you're going to have to show me why my interpretation of the ITC document isn't correct. And if you show me a contradiction, I'm just going to point you back to the first point, and that is this isn't authoritative anyway. So it doesn't cancel out anything from Florence. So it's still the case that if somebody dies in a state of original sin, that is definitive teaching. And it's still also the case that we can speak of limbo as a theoretical possibility insofar as this actually happening to somebody. This actually being the case. Both are true. But let me help Father out here. Let me give him a better one. Because again, this is not authoritative. This is not authoritative. Let me help him out. Number one, you had sacred scripture. Yes, nobody will see the kingdom of heaven without baptism. But as we know, baptism can be given either through the sacrament itself, or you can receive it through the desire thereof. And is it possible for someone to exercise that desire on your behalf? Those are questions that we can engage. But number two, scripture also teaches that God desires God desires the salvation of all. So God has to make a means available for them somehow to see God in the beatific vision. And somebody might say, well, he does. He makes baptism available to them. Well, for some people, there were plenty of people who never had the opportunity to be baptized. So no, God did not make the means available for them. So that doesn't work. God has to make some other means available to them, and it's a means known only to him. The only means that we have available to us is baptism. We have no other means to bring somebody to the kingdom of heaven. We, as humans, have no other means. All we have is baptism. Does God have another means? I have to believe he does if I believe the New Testament, since he desires the salvation of all. He has to at least make a means available to them. Doesn't mean that they're always carried out. Doesn't mean they're always executed, but at least there's a potential for them. That's why Father is being presumptuous in saying that we know that they are given those means. No, we don't know that. But we can know that something is given to them, but we don't know if it's executed. But let me help him out here. Here's something that is magisterial, and it's from Vatican II. It says, all this holds true. This is from Gaudium et Spes. All this holds true not only for Christians, but all men of goodwill in whose heart grace works in an unseen way. For since Christ died for all men, and since the ultimate vocation of man is in fact one and divine, we ought to believe that the Holy Spirit, in a manner known only to God, listen to that, in a manner known only to God, offers to every man the possibility of being associated with the Paschal mystery. It's not talking about baptism, because we know about baptism, but it's saying in a manner known only to God, offers the possibility of being associated with the crucifixion and the work of redemption, the Paschal mystery, if you will, the work of redemption. He makes it available to them in some way, known only to God. That includes unbaptized infants. Again, we don't know the means. We can speculate on what that might be. Vicarious baptism of desire. Maybe the parents wish for their child, their unbaptized child, to be saved. And maybe God uses that as a baptism of desire vicariously through them. There's some attestation for that, believe it or not, in the fathers. I think I'm the only one to bring that up so far. Infulgentias. I've never seen anybody bring that up. But that's a theological opinion. We don't know, because it's a manner known only to God. We don't know that with certainty, because God has never said, here's the means available to them aside from baptism. And it's obviously, again, not talking about baptism. So God makes a means available to unbaptized infants. He makes it available, but that's not the same as saying, and in every single instance, that means is successfully used. Those are two different things. God presents salvation to unbaptized infants. I don't know how. I can speculate, but I don't know how. But that doesn't automatically mean that those means are automatically successful. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It could be that God saves every infant who is unbaptized. It could be he saves every one of them and nobody goes to limbo. It could be that he saves none of them and no unbaptized infant goes to heaven. They all go to limbo. It could be a combination that he saves some and not others. And don't say that's unjust, because God doesn't owe anybody heaven. He doesn't owe anyone grace. Don't say that's unjust. It's not an issue of justice. You might say that's unfitting or something, but that's not unjust. But ultimately, we don't know. It could be any combination of things, because we're now in an area of speculation, because God has not spoken in this area. Therefore, we don't know. But what we do know is some means is available to them. So again, the rad trad is wrong in saying they absolutely die in this state and they always go to limbo, and you can never hope they go to heaven, and there's no other means available to them. The church talks about no other means available to them. On our part, it talks about us having nothing other than baptism to give them. That's on our part, but what about God? God's not bound to the sacraments. And here the church says there's a manner known only to God in which he makes available to them salvation. And obviously, again, it's not baptism. It could be the desire for baptism, but it's not the sacrament itself. But again, this is magisterial. This does require religious submission of intellect and will. But this is you can harmonize this with Florence. They don't contradict each other. Florence is saying if you die in this state of original sin, you go to limbo. This is saying that's true, but God also makes a means available to these infants. That's also true. And you can harmonize those. That's not a rupture. That's not a contradiction. As Father Reese was arguing over and over, that he slammed the door on limbo. He got rid of limbo. He threw out limbo, contradicts limbo. There's a change in church teaching. The church just too embarrassed to say that it believes something dumb. All that nonsensical rhetoric. For what? He was wrong at the end of the day. And so all this rhetoric for nothing. Lastly, you see this in the catechism. Obviously, the catechism is not authoritative in and of itself. It's authoritative insofar as it's relying on an authoritative document to back it up. But it says this, as regards to children who have died without baptism, the church can entrust them to the mercy of God, as she does in her funeral rites. So we have funeral rites for unbaptized infants where we entrust them to the mercy of God. We can't say for sure that they receive the mercy of God. We don't know that. We can entrust them, but we can't presume upon God's grace. Indeed, the great mercy of God, who desires that all men should be saved, and Jesus' tenderness towards children, which caused him to say, "Let the children come to me, do not hinder them," allows us to hope. Hope is not certitude. Father Reese was wrong to say they have certitude that their unbaptized infant is in heaven. You're wrong, Father. You don't have that certitude. You can have a hope, however. You might even argue it's a strong hope. Perhaps, perhaps. But it's a hope, not certitude. Allows us to hope that there is a way of salvation for children who have died without baptism. All the more urgent is the church is called to not to prevent little children coming to Christ through the gift of holy baptism. Okay. If you look at the funeral rites of the church, again, it does speak of the mercy and hope. Liturgy also informs our theology, and in ways, our theology informs our liturgy too. But you can see in our liturgy, we speak of hope. You can see in the Second Vatican Council, there's some kind of hope there because there's some kind of means available to them. And again, none of that contradicts Florence. So here's a summary of everything. Worst case scenario, an unbaptized infant is in a place of perfect natural happiness and natural communion with God. Not a bad thing. Think of the best possible life you could ever have and then multiply it by 1,000,000, and then you still won't have even just the perfect understanding of natural happiness, let alone supernatural. So they have perfect life of natural happiness and natural knowledge of God, and even a natural knowledge of the saints, like family members in heaven and stuff. So that's not bad. And that's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, an unbaptized infant is in heaven. That's the best case scenario. Okay. So at the end of the day, this should not be something emotional for anybody because either way, it's a win. And number two, there's no contradiction here between the ITC, what the church says today, and what it said in Florence before. Number three, you can't just throw away Florence as if it's not authoritative. It is definitive in nature, but you have to understand what it's defining and what it's teaching definitively. And it's, in a way, as I showed, it can be harmonized with what the church teaches today that's also authoritative. And likewise, people can't just bank on a misunderstanding of limbo from Florence and ignore everything in the post-conciliar church, thinking that somehow they're being pious and traditional. No, you're not. It is not traditional to reject the magisterium. That is not traditional. You're being a Protestant. Stop doing that. So, and there's no reason to do it. It's foolish anyway because there's no contradiction anyway. So don't dismiss what Vatican II is saying and the catechism is saying and, Gaudium et Spes or the funeral rites. Don't dismiss these things. Don't dismiss that hope that we can have. All right. Do y'all have any questions? If so, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll do my best to respond. Put them to at Reason and Theology. Do my best to answer. Let me grab a little bit more coffee. I'll give y'all just a few minutes to put some questions there in the chat, and I'll be right back. All right. Somebody says here, harsh but true had to be said. Well, look, I'm sorry, but Father Reese's article was ridiculous. To call it dumb is such an insult and disrespect to the church that he serves. Number one, it's unnecessary because he's wrong. And then number three, it's disrespectful to God because God infallibly teaches through the Council of Florence that this is a theoretical possibility. You know, for anybody who actually does die in this state, they go there. That's disrespectful to God who teaches through his church definitively that if you die in that state, you go here. Don't call that dumb. You're calling God's church and God teaching through his church dumb. Talk about impiety. I'm sorry, I just don't have a whole lot of respect and tolerance for that, especially for somebody who's representing the church. Stop misrepresenting our church and stop insulting our church from within the church. Stop doing that. It's hard to respect a priest who would act that way. Now, I respect him for his office, but that behavior I do not respect. And likewise, the radical traditionalists know better. So hard to respect their behavior. Saying Vatican II is teaching heresy. The church teaches heresy. It rejects the dogma of limbo. Stop this nonsense. You're wrong as well. There's no contradiction here. And you don't even know what you're talking about anyway. So the radical progressives and the radical traditionalists, it's just like seeing this kind of stuff, it's hard to not be harsh at some point, you know. Now maybe I need to work on my patience and, you know, mercy stuff. Maybe. But I think you can understand why it's very hard to not just come out and bluntly say, stop it, both of you. You're behaving ridiculous. And both of y'all don't know what you're talking about. Let's see. If limbo is so dumb, all the other teachings, disrespect for one teaching leads to disrespect for more. Well, maybe if somebody wants to be consistent in their behavior, sure. Aren't we already in limbo? No. Are you at a place of perfect natural happiness and natural communion with God? Are you? Probably not. I'm not. I don't think anybody is. Now, we might actually have supernatural communion with God, not in the beatific vision, but through grace. But you're not in a state of perfect natural happiness. You're not in limbo. Purgatory is the stairway to the gates of heaven. Limbo is the lobby. Don't know if I'd put it that way. Let's see. Do Eastern Christians have a version of limbo? No. And Toll Houses is not a version of limbo. In the Eastern tradition, it is not nearly as thought out as the Western tradition. This is one of the deficiencies that I see sometimes in Eastern theology. Now, the East certainly has plenty of merits and plenty of strengths, but this is not one of them. The West tends to do better at theological precision than the East on the whole. And this is an area where the East was less precise and basically said they don't go to heaven and they don't go to the place of the damned. You might say, well, that sounds like limbo. Maybe, but they don't really specify the nature of it or the state of it. So not exactly. But you could say, but it's close. It's like in the same ballpark. So it can kind of be harmonized. Maybe. But you're speculating because the East hasn't really said anything beyond that. And here I'm not talking about the East as a whole. I'm just talking about among some of the fathers in the East. If hell is eternal separation from God and apart from God, happiness is impossible. Wait, no. I want to challenge that. How can there be a realm of hell in which perfect natural happiness? Okay, you're confusing supernatural happiness and natural happiness. Apart from a supernatural communion with God, you cannot have a supernatural happiness. But you can have a natural happiness with a natural communion with God in limbo. Michael says, I'm sorry if I missed this, but do souls in limbo go to heaven after the final judgment? That is entirely speculative. It's a theological opinion, but it has almost no basis to it. So it's not a common theological opinion. It's tolerated, I would say. I would argue it's tolerated. But there's no real reason, like solid grounds to believe that that's the case. But again, is it a tolerated theological opinion? I would argue yes. He says Hades is thrown into the lake of fire then, so I don't know, limbo could remain pleasant. Yeah, but what I take the book of Revelation to be meaning there when it speaks of Hades being thrown into the lake of fire is the damned, the souls of the damned in Hades. Because in the context, it's talking about the damned. And here we're talking about the damned who are not just suffering a loss of the beatific vision, but the damned who are suffering the pain of senses due to actual sins, like those damned. So I don't think that that's a slam dunk. Thanks for doing this video on limbo. It's been very helpful, and it will help talking about baptismal regeneration with Protestants. Yeah. Real question now. Do you know any early we can find in the church fathers the concept of limbo? Okay. Well, again, it depends on what some of the Eastern fathers are referring to. Gregory of Nyssa writes about unbaptized infants and their fate, and he basically says, I don't know. He says, I mean, they're not, and he doesn't use the best argument, sadly. He says they're not in the place of rewards, in heaven, because that would be unfair to the people who, merited rewards. And I want to say that's not a good analogy or a good point, because Jesus talks about people coming in at the 11th hour and they haven't, earned any rewards. And so not a really good argument, but he says that they're not in heaven, but they're also like not where a Hitler would be, or somebody who's committed actual sins would be. What does that mean? He says, I don't know. Could that be limbo? A version of limbo? It could be, but he doesn't really specify, because he just says, I don't know. So that's more your Eastern tradition. The West started to really get into limbo, especially after Augustine. Prior to Augustine, the Western fathers were just like the Eastern fathers. I don't know. Was kind of their thing. Will those in limbo be aware of Christ in some capacity? If there's anybody in limbo, yes, they would have a natural knowledge of God. Yes, which includes Christ. A natural knowledge. Let's see. Are those in limbo aware of what's going on earth? Entirely speculative. We don't know. Similar to saints to heaven. Entirely speculative. If God wants them to be aware, then yes. If there's anyone in limbo. But entirely speculative. Let's see. I think I grabbed everything that was related to this video. Trying to make sure I didn't miss anything else related to the video. Nick French says, to be fair, we haven't done limbo at a church party in like 10 years. That's funny. Let's see. Are we on question time yet? Yes, but we're at the very end, so you better put in the question like really fast, maybe within the next 10 seconds. Would limbo only be for those who don't commit actual sins, unbaptized infants? Is it possible for unbaptized people who try to live a righteous life according to natural law to go there? If the person who has lived a life with no actual sins, then yeah. Who is that? Nobody, because everybody from the moment of reason pretty much has chosen to commit an actual sin. So if there's somebody out there, it's like one guy. Like they would have to die at literally the second of reaching the age of accountability or something. It's just who it would be such a small group of people, you know. Am I still studying for my doctorate degree? I'm still working on the dissertation. Yeah. I'm almost done with editing my book for Catholic Answers, and then I can get back to my dissertation. So I'm actually going to be done with that today or tomorrow, as far as the editing the book for Catholic Answers. So that will be out soon. The book on answering Eastern Orthodox objections to Catholicism. So stay tuned for more. My best explanation for why they shouldn't leave the Catholic Church for Orthodoxy. Well, it's off topic, right? And you'll certainly want to read my book on this because it's written for people exactly like you. But in short, because the East has accepted the papal claims in the ecumenical councils, so you can't hold to the ecumenical councils without holding to the papal claims. So the ecclesiology that they are bound to accept is incompatible with what they're actually doing and what they profess. Also, they were in communion with heretics because they claim that the Filioquist West is basically heretical for teaching the Filioque, and yet they were in communion with the Filioquist West for centuries. So what does that say about them? Well, it says that they were in communion for centuries knowingly with a Filioquist West. So they were knowingly in communion for centuries with heretics. That doesn't really help their case. Also a major problem. If you want, I go into this in way more detail here on the channel. Go to my Eastern Orthodoxy playlist, Answering Eastern Orthodoxy playlist. I have plenty of stuff there for you. So check that out in the meantime. But since we're off topic, I'll leave it at that. Let's see. What is it about baptism ritual that enables God to fully embrace the soul he created? None of that is accurate. None of that is accurate. It's not a question of embracing a soul he created. That's not what it is. God already embraces souls that he created prior to that. I think what you're asking me is, what is it about baptism that saves a person, is what you're asking. God has chosen as his ordinary means to use baptism as the means through which he gives people grace, and namely the grace of initial justification, among other graces. So it's the ordinary means he uses to save people. It's not the only way. Like, God can save people however he wants. God is not bound to the sacraments, however we are. So we have to administer them. We have to make use of them. But God doesn't have to. Why did God choose to use baptism? He could have chosen to use something else, but God has chosen to use baptism as the ordinary way. Why? Could be because it reflects the washing and cleansing nature of what takes place. That's one of the reasons why. Okay, well, I think that's everything that's related to the question of limbo. So I'll go ahead and end it there. All right, well, I hope this has been helpful. If so, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Let me know in the comment section if you enjoyed this and you want to see more stuff like it. But yeah, that's going to do it. Hit the like button, as I said, and also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, if you want to get access to extra content and support me. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time.